we're here tonight to talk specifically about the SAT and ACT and how things have changed dramatically, even over the last couple of years. So let's get started. What's going on in college admissions? Well, look at this Common App data. We can see that there is a dramatic increase in applications from just right before COVID, where students across the country submitted about 2 million applications collectively, to now we're at about 3.35 million applications, which is about a 65% increase. It's massive. And part of this is because colleges went test optional during COVID. And so at that time, students that may not have applied to a school because they wouldn't have met the testing requirements said, let me try. I'll throw my hat into the ring and see what happens. And so we're seeing now that the outcome of all of this is that colleges are receiving lots and lots of applications. Not so much the less selective schools that are pretty easy to get into, but definitely the schools that are competitive. And what's also happened is that schools are saying, oh gosh, all these kids are so qualified. Many of these students have really great GPAs. They've taken challenging classes. Another data point would be just so helpful. And we see that a lot in the headlines across the country. You may have seen this as well, where some of the most selective schools have come out and said, you know what, we need to get another data point. So we've seen that schools like Harvard, Brown, Yale have changed their policies to requiring students to submit a test score. And it's not, that telling that it's these schools, but what often happens is these schools are a proxy for what's to come. And that's what's occurred. In Georgia, for example, it started out as just University of Georgia and Georgia Tech want to see test scores, but now it's all the schools, the flagship universities in Georgia, University of Florida, Purdue, schools like Tennessee, which sometimes were a safety school or a target school for some students. They're so competitive now, they want to see a test score. LSU. So we're just seeing this shift in schools saying, wait, hold on a second. That data would be really helpful. In addition, you may have also, I'm sure you have seen changes for the SAT, that it's a digital version now and it's adaptive, which we'll talk about. And then lastly, the ACT just a few months ago announced this fundamental change in their own test, starting in 2025. So tonight we're going to kind of break through all of this noise and talk a lot about the SAT and the ACT, and not just that, help you and your students to start thinking strategically about college applications. So I mentioned about this other data point. So if your child decides, you know what, I want to take an SAT or an ACT, I want to practice for this test, do my best and take it and see how I do. Maybe I'll take it a couple times and submit my score to the school that I'm applying to. What is the pro of submitting a score to a college that might be test optional? Meaning they're saying, hey, if you want to submit a test, you can, but you're not required. Here's the thing. Many test optional schools, 4 years ago, they really were test optional. These days, not so much. They are wondering why you haven't submitted a test score if you were able to take a test, especially in the selective schools. So pros, again, provides another data point. It shows initiative that you took the time out of your busy schedule to prepare and take a test. And the other thing that I think is so helpful to think about when it comes to scores is that you can use them selectively. Ideally, students have a balanced list of schools. That means they have their most likely schools, the schools that they think they can get into. They have the target schools. They have an equal chance of getting it or maybe not. And then they have the reach schools. These would be the schools that are going to be hard to get into for that student. You do not have to use your test scores equally. You might use them for your target schools and definitely your most likely, but maybe not all your reach schools, depending where you fall in their range. So you want to use your scores strategically. Also, scores are often required for merit-based financial aid. Con, it's one less data point. An example is University of Virginia. It's a really selective school. 76% of students who were admitted last year, so actually it was about a year and a half ago, I suspect that it's going to be even much higher for this admission season, is pretty significant. 76% of all the students. So clearly that data point is helpful to them. If you don't submit it, there may be greater scrutiny on other points of your application, like your grades, your essays, your extracurriculars, all those kinds of things. So let's dive a little bit deeper and talk about both of these tests and what they look like. Even now, with the changes in the SAT and this digital format, it's still considered a power test. And that means that they give you more time for each question on the SAT because the questions aren't always so straightforward. They often require a little bit of critical thinking and analysis. So the difficulty in the digital SAT, now just called the SAT, is in the interpretation and analyzing the questions to really understand what they're asking of you. Now, on the other hand, the current ACT, we'll talk about the new one in a little bit, but the current ACT is considered a speed test, meaning that you've got to go at a pretty fast clip to get through all of the questions in order to finish each module on time. So for that reason, the questions are shorter and they're more straightforward. Sometimes students will say, oh, I really like these questions. They're kind of like student friendly. They're the kinds of questions students would see in school. But again, the difficulty is in the pacing. It's in the speed at which you have to go to get that test done. But here's what's important to know about both tests. They hold the same weight. If a college is going to look at your test scores, they do not care whether you take the SAT or the ACT. It totally doesn't matter. Often parents will say, well, I've heard that Maryland likes the SAT over the ACT, or I heard that Vanderbilt likes this test over that test. It's really not true. Students can take either test. They can take both tests if they want, but it's not necessary. Actually, we'll talk about this in a second. You want to take a look at your scores and determine initially which test you're likely to do best on and just prepare for that one test. You don't have to do best. You don't have to do both. So that leads us to what is the best test for my child? Which test should my student take? Even if they don't submit their test scores to all their schools, how do I know? And here's what often happens. Parents call our office and they're looking for help around testing. And they'll often say, I'm not sure. Sometimes they'll say, my child has taken the PSAT their sophomore year and their junior year. They like that this new SAT is shorter and that it's digital. And since they have this comfort level with the College Board and the SAT, they just want to do that test. And we say, fabulous, that's great. Let's prepare them for that test. Sometimes parents will come in and say, you know what, my child's taken a PSAT and didn't do so well. They went online and took a practice test on the College Board's website and still not so great. I'm wondering if there are any other options. And then we'll have the student take a practice ACT and we'll determine by putting their scores into a concordance table which test they're scoring better on. And what we found is that about a third of students definitely score better on one test over the other. But for the other 2/3, it's honestly a toss-up. And it comes down to personal preference. Which test do they feel most familiar with? And that's really the test that they should prepare for and take. So that's a little bit about which test is best. Let's talk about some of the details and the changes that have taken place and that will take place. So let's start out with the SAT. The pencil and paper, the Scantron books from last year are gone. And now we have a brand new digital version. It is the same 1600 scale that we've had for a number of years. But the big difference, there's a number of differences, but one of the differences that kids love is instead of 3 hours, it's now 2 hours. And you get about 82 seconds per question. So that's a good amount of time to figure out each question. Here's what is also important. The SAT only has two sections. It has math and it has evidence-based reading and writing. And for students that don't love math, sometimes they're taken aback a little bit and they'll say, ooh, half the test is math? That's not really my strong suit. Maybe I should consider the ACT. It's also adaptive. Adaptive means that it's just on your performance. We've had adaptive tests in education for many years, but never for a high-stakes college admissions test. And that's why it was such a big change for the College Board. So let's take a look at what that means. So there's two modules on the math section. Let's say the student sees module 1. On module 1, and again, this is showing you an example of an adaptive test. The student sees easy, medium, and hard math questions. Now, if the student doesn't do well in module 1, the software isn't going to continue peppering them with hard questions and even harder questions. The software is going to say, oh, wait, these were kind of difficult for you. Let me give you mostly medium, some easy, and a few hard questions. I'm going to give you the easier module 2. If you do well on module 1, the software will say, oh, you did well. Let me give you some medium, some hard, and some very hard questions, which is the harder version of module 2. And so in order to get a top score, you have to be able to do well on module 1 and then go to the harder questions on module 2. So you might be thinking, what is a hard question? And what does that look like in terms of the math I've already taken? Well, here's the breakdown. Easy questions are generally about pre-algebra. Medium are algebra 1 and geometry. And by the way, we'll talk about this a little bit later when we talk about practicing content. Geometry is often a class kids have not seen in a while, and they sometimes need remediation in that one area. And then the hard questions are algebra 2, and very hard would be pre-calc and trig. So that's what the math looks like, the adaptive nature of it. The SAT also has an adaptive reading and writing section. And the reading and writing passages with this new test are shorter. They used to be really long and arduous, and now they're pretty short and they're followed by multiple choice questions. And when we've analyzed the tests, one of our lead test prep tutor, Pete Pecoraro, found that there are really 5 critical skills. There's vocabulary and context, not, what does this word mean? But in the context of this passage, what does it mean? What's the main idea? Reading for data, which is actually kind of similar to the ACT science. We'll talk about that. The writing part is not a free write, but instead is grammar, punctuation, sentence structure. And then lastly, synthesis of bullets, which is a newer part of the digital SAT. So that's what the SAT looks like. Let's take a look at the current ACT. And we're going to see this version of the ACT for about the next year. So if you're a senior, you would be taking this version of the ACT. If you're a junior, you can also take this version of the ACT and be served perfectly well. So this test is still pencil and paper. It's still the little Scantron booklet that students are used to with the little oval bubble sheets. It is a long test. I will not lie. It's about 3 hours. And students have to go at a pretty quick clip, as I mentioned as well, 49 seconds per question, opposed to 82 seconds per question on the SAT. But with the ACT, there are 4 sections: English, math, reading, and science. You can use a calculator just like you can on the ACT. It is not adaptive. It does not change with you. And the max score is 36 points. So 36 is a perfect score. The ACT has 4 sections, and this is really important. The English section is grammar, punctuation, sentence structure, rhetorical skills. Math, algebra 1, algebra 2, geometry, some trig, but not as much advanced math as you'll see on the SATs. In reading, you're going to see 4 passages, fiction, social studies, humanities, and there's 10 questions per passage. So to some students, it feels like a lot. And this is the differentiator. There is a science section currently. The science section actually doesn't have anything to do with knowing biology, chemistry, physics. Instead, it's actually more like reading comprehension. You're looking at graphs, you're looking at charts, tables, research summaries, and you're extrapolating information to answer questions. And I will say that we believe here at Educational Connections that the science section is the most coachable section. It's the easiest area because a lot of times kids come in and they're like, oh, I didn't know how to do this part. And so it's much easier to teach the skills necessary to interpret a graph or a chart and to improve your score. So that's what it looks like right now. But the ACT, which, by the way, was bought out by a private equity company earlier this year, and it's going to transition from a nonprofit to a for-profit company. And the ACT really, really, really wants to compete with the College Board. And they know that the one thing the College Board has done that makes kids want to take that test is they've shortened it. So the ACT is going to do the same thing. They're making it 2 hours as opposed to 3. They also realize that, asking kids to work at this very fast rate has been taxing and sometimes anxiety provoking. So they're going to give kids more time per question. They're going to shorten those really long passages with lots of questions to shorter passages and reading in English. They'll still use the same 36-point scale, but now they're going to take the English, math, and reading, and they're going to make that the composite score. They're only taking 3 sections and making a score. The science is going to become optional for the ACT. However, I was just on a call with the ACT about a month ago, and they said that they're going to roll out another composite for math and for science for students that are applying to, say, an engineering school, and they want to show that they have a really good STEM score. This new test is going to debut for everybody in September of 2025. So those are the big changes. One thing that hasn't changed with both tests is that students with a 504 or an IEP, where they get accommodations in class, will still continue to get the same accommodations. And the most utilized accommodation is time and a half, which is really, really helpful. Instead of having 2 hours to do a test, now you have 3 hours. That's really wonderful. So if you do have an IEP or a 504, make sure you're talking to your counselor about applying for those accommodations. But both tests offer them, equally, the SAT and the ACT. And what's helpful to know also is that colleges do not know if you've used an accommodation, such as extra time, because the Americans with Disabilities Act states that it can't be used in admissions decisions. So schools do not know that you've been given extra time or you've had another accommodation when they're evaluating your application. All right, so let me take a look at the chat and see if see what questions we have about the SAT. Oh, somebody said, will a presentation be shared afterwards? And the answer is yes, we're recording this. We're going to send it out to you tomorrow. Let's see. Does the speed apply to students with extended time? And the answer right now, if you have an accommodation of extra time and you want to take the ACT, I'd say that's a good idea. because remember, the hard part of the SAT is that it's fast. But if you take away that obstacle and now that's not the issue, it may be the better test for you. It used to be that before the SAT shortened, pretty much all our accommodation students were taking the ACT, but now I've seen definitely more kids go to the College Board test really because of the time. But I do like the ACT a lot for kids with time and a half. Can you explain reading and writing in Module 1? So one thing that parents often ask about the writing section is they think it's maybe a free write or an essay, and it's not. It's more, the students are shown a passage and they're asked about grammar, for example. This is an area that kids are often, they need help with. They need help with understanding grammar rules because for one reason or another, they haven't gotten enough of it. So we do spend time working with them on that. So again, the writing portion is more grammar related to writing. And let's see, Patricia said, will the new ACT still be on paper? And the answer is no, they're moving to put that online too. But what's interesting about the new ACT, and thank you for asking that, Patricia, is that the new test, like unlike the College Board's test, where it's clearly created for a digital format, it's basically going to be the Scantron book online. So it's not like you can go and, it's not like a real online test. It's basically the same thing you'd see in the booklet. It's just online. And you can put your answers in online. It is not adaptive with the new ACT. And in fact, when I was on this call with the ACT, they said, we've realized the adaptive thing is really, really stressing kids out. And we don't want kids to feel like, oh my gosh, if I don't do well on this first module, I'm in a heap of trouble. We don't want kids to feel like that. So that's why they decided we're not going to make this new ACT adaptive. Let's see. Somebody asked about scores for specific schools, and I would recommend looking at the school's website specifically for what their incoming class was like. We'll talk more about that in a second. So let's keep going and talk a little bit about the upcoming dates. So here's what's coming up for the ACT: September, October, December, February, SAT, October, November, December, March. And so in general, these testing organizations will have a test once a month or every other month. And it's important because you need to register for the test about a month before the actual date, unless you want to pay a fee closer to the date. So it's better to give yourself time. The other thing we recommend is to pair test dates. What you don't want to do is say, I don't know, I'm going to sign my child up for December and just randomly pick a test date and not have a plan behind it. You want to pick the first test date so it's far enough out that your child has time to prepare for it. Certainly, they can just go and take it blindly. But I think it's best, especially to dial back anxiety over test taking, to be prepared, to at least have some preparation before you're going into your first test date. The reason we recommend picking 2 dates is because you want to take the test the first time. It's not going to be the best representation of your skills. It's your first time out and you're nervous and it's long. But you want to get your test score back. You look at your test, you look at your scores, and then you prepare some more and you take it again. Now you have a strategy instead of some random date you picked. So you're pairing test dates. ACT, maybe it's October and December, or perhaps February and April of your junior year. The SAT, maybe you're doing the October-December test or the March and May test. Those are really popular for the SAT. But by and large, we recommend taking the test 2 to 3 times your junior year. It used to be, years ago, that kids would take the test the spring of their junior year, and that's how it was done. But as anxiety around admissions has ramped up, what we've seen in our program is that parents are calling and they want their students to take the test earlier and often, like the fall of their junior year. It's fine, they can still take it. But remember, it may not be their best test score. Statistically speaking, kids get their best test score the spring of their junior year. And it's for a few reasons. They're older and they're more mature. They have more curriculum under their belt, meaning they've been in class longer, and they have more time to prepare. And so if your child has already taken advanced math, maybe they did really well on the PSAT, it's fine if they take all their testing in the fall. Maybe your child has a big spring sport and they're not going to be dedicated to that, to testing, preparing and testing in the spring. We get it. That's fine too. But really be diligent about deciding on, the best test dates for your student in terms of their availability, their willingness to prepare, and the math class that they're taking, and the strength of their grades. Sometimes we see kids that will come in and we'll look at their transcript, we'll talk to the parent, and we'll say, you know what, I don't think you should do test prep right now. I think your time and money is going to be better spent on having a tutor to improve these two classes and improve your grades, because that's what's going to be most compelling to the schools on your list. So let's do that in the fall and then prepare in the spring for tests. So get help with your testing plan. Talk to your counselor. We're happy to help you. I'll put in a link to contacting us in just a moment. But your testing plan is really important. The other value of taking the test multiple times is that there's something called super scoring. So super scoring is basically when you have taken a test and you've gotten your top scores at different times. Look at this example. Maybe you got on the SAT a 23 in reading in April. In June, you got a 23 in English and science. And in September, you got a 23 in math. Instead of submitting a 21 or a 22, your super score composite is a 23. And that is a heck of a lot better than a 21. And so when scores are super scored, colleges only see your super score. When admissions counselors log in to their software, up pops your super score, and that's what they see. And so that's another value of taking it multiple times. I saw a question in the chat, and somebody asked, how long out should my child prep for the test? And the answer is, or what we recommend is that it's usually about 2 to 4 months, sometimes 5 months, but typically about 2 to 4 months before your first test. And it's important because there are a number of factors. Number one, we want to see where you're starting from. What is your baseline score? So that might be, if you're going to take the ACT, it might be the practice ACT you're done. Maybe it's your PSAT. So we need to see, where are you starting, and really, where do you want to be based on your list? And we'll have that conversation. And then we'll make a recommendation to you based on where you're starting and where you realistically want to be. This is our recommendation for prep. We also work online with kids, and so it's much, much more flexible to work around busy schedules. And often that makes it easier to put in sessions. I found that sessions are best when they're once a week, because students are going to have to do practice in between some homework. And that's really how the brain functions best. We used to do boot camps years ago, and they don't work because you're just trying to do a crash course of all this information before the test. We used to also do groups and one-to-one, and then we looked at the data, and it was clear that one-to-one was definitely resulted in better test scores. And, for a number of reasons. One, it's tailored specifically to you, but also you're preparing over time. So you learn something, you practice it, you sleep on it, your brain has time to regurgitate the information. And those are important things in preparing. So when we work with kids, and I would recommend this with anything that you do, whether your child drives to Barnes and Noble and gets a test prep, good old fashioned test prep book, whether they do something online, whether they take a group class or they have one-to-one tutoring, um, we've had the best results with three things. Number one, kids need to know strategy. They need to know when I see a problem that I don't know or a passage that I'm not sure how to tackle, what is the best strategy for this question? What's the best strategy to start out with this math problem? Should I work backwards? Those things are called strategy, and kids need help with that. Content. That means I mentioned some kids don't remember the grammar rules. They haven't seen geometry in a long time. Shoring up content they might be weak with is another way to improve your scores. And then simulated practice tests. And this is really what helps kids that feel anxious. You want to use practice tests from the retired tests from the College Board and the ACT, not some that you find online that somebody else has written. They need to be the actual test. And for the College Board test, 1, 2, and 3 online tend to be a little bit easier than 4, 5, and 6. So the main thing is that you should have content, strategy, simulated practice tests. And the other thing I would recommend is, we always say in education, work on your child's strengths, do what you love, those types of things. But the opposite is true for test preparation. With test prep, you really want to work on your weaker areas because that's what actually improves your score more than working on everything equally. So that's a little bit about test prep. But test scores are really just part of the equation. They're not everything, especially if you're applying to schools that truly are test optional. Some are test optional and they're really not because they need that data point, and some truly are. So it's usually the lesser selective schools that are truly test optional. But aside from test scores, there are other ways to stand out for sure. They include, what are the courses that you took? Did you take challenging classes? Did you take AP, IB, or dual enrollment classes? Did you take classes that align with what you love? Do you want to go into marketing? Did you take an elective in marketing? Do you love math? Did you take that engineering class? You mentioned you love performing arts. What did you do in the art realm? So your course selection, your rigor, certainly your extracurriculars. On the Common App, there's 10 slots to put in your extracurriculars. You don't want to slap anything in there. You really need to go about that very strategically, and you do not need to fill out every last line. So that can differentiate you. What you did over the summer can differentiate you. And certainly your essays. Your essays are key. This is the one thing. Kids can have the same grades as you. They can pick the same classes as you. But your essay is unique to you. And that's what shows the school you're applying to. Here's a little bit about me that you're not going to find in my transcript. So I would say that also differentiating yourself is a craft. Certainly more so than it was 5 years ago, even certainly 10 years ago. It's very, very different. I was reading an article this afternoon in the San Francisco Chronicle all about college admissions, and they forecasted that this year's senior class has more students than ever before, than in many, many years. And so it's likely, I'm not sure what the junior class is going to look like, but it's likely that the kids in the senior year are going to experience a very, very competitive environment, even more than last year, just because of their age. And so finding your way to stand out to your schools is really imperative. I know that you may have this through your school, but it can also be helpful to you. It's a college prep checklist for what to do in each year from 9th grade to 10th grade to 11th grade, and then what to do in your senior year too. But you can find this on our website, and you can download it at ectutoring.com/college-consulting. So I'd love to go into Q&A, and I know that I've seen a ton of questions, so I'm going to go to that in just a second. And I want to mention that we're happy to talk to you. If you need help with your testing plans, if you want to talk about test preparation for your child, or maybe you're curious about college consulting, we're happy to talk to you. And you can scan this QR link. You can look at our website and schedule a call. It's a 20-minute strategy call. So on that note, I don't want to keep you all too much longer. It was such a pleasure to speak with you tonight. Please, if you don't mind taking the survey at the end, we would appreciate it. I wish you all the best for the remainder of the school year.